Disclaimer: if you're watching this video sometime after the upload, please check the pinned comment first before commenting. Clarifications and corrections will probably be found there.
آره من خب توی فضای موسیقی ایرانی بزرگ شدم. پدرم استاد سنتور و ویولون، معلم موسیقی. خودم هم سنتور میزنم.
خودت هم سنتور میزنی؟ اوکی، من خب موسیقی برات بذارم، موسیقی که اسمشون هست پرژن میوزیک و اینا رو یوتیوب. تو فقط بهم بگو خودت که ایرانی هستی، موزیسین ایرانی هستی، بهم بگو اگر به نظر تو چیز دیگه آیا موسیقی ایرانی هست یا نه.
هندی اسم میکنم.
آره کسی ایرانی بندید یا
ایرانی
نه؟
نمیدونم.
این چی؟
این که ارمنی هستن، دودوکه دیگه. این که دیگه اصلا هندی شد. یا مثلا پاکستانی.
ایرانی نیست بازار تو؟
نه.
اگه میگفتم بهت عربیه؟ خب سلام مهندس، حالت خوبه؟ تحصیل کردی دیگه تو موسیقی سنتی ایران در تهران. تو چی میزدی؟ ستار میزدی اونجا؟
هم ستار زدم هم اود. یه هنرستان موسیقی بود که همون کنسرواتوار قدیم بود.
آها.
نه ایرانی نیست.
نه؟
یعنی یه حالتی داره انگار احساس میکنی که خیلی دیپ تو موزیک شرقی نیست دیگه. یعنی یه چیز مثلا یه حالت برداشتیه از موسیقی شرق توسط یه آدم غربی که خیلی آشنایی نداره با موسیقی شرق. کلاسیک داریم، مثلا یه آهنگساز انگلیسی از کتلبی اومده یه چیزی ساخته پرژن مارکت. پرژن مارکت مثلا هیچ ربطی به واقعا بازار ایرانی یا اصلا موزیک ایرانی نداره. یه برداشتی داشته یه مقداری از موزیک ایژیانای مثلا یه مقدار حالت
مثل اون آلاتورکه های موزارت و اینا بودن.
آها آره
تو مایاس دیگه کم.
آره.
یعنی که من برداشت من میدونم وقتی من موسیقی رو گوش میدم حس میکنم که این کسی که اینو ساخت فریم ورک تئوریکش کاملا غربیه.
دقیقاً من اینا که میگم دلیل بر نیست موزیک خوب نیست، موزیک خوبیه، اما چون سوال این بوده که
خیلی قشنگم. منم اینه یعنی من میگم از نظر هنری خیلی هم زیباست. بیشتر برداشتم اینجا اتنو موزیکولوژیکاله دیگه.
باز یه آهنگساز غربی که مثلا میخواد دودوک استفاده کنه، دودوک کنم تبلا و اینا، هیچ کدوم اصلا به ایران ذاتاً ربط نداره. ساوندش اونجوریه، ساوندش واسه غربی‌ها ساوند خیلی شرقیه. آخه به آهنگساز غربی یه چیزی از بین دودوک و تبلا و نم بلی دنسینگ و همه اینا رو یه جوری با هم دیگه قاطی میکنن که صدای چیز شرقی بده، میدونی؟ اون مثلا حالت رنگ شرقی بهش بده.
رنگ شرقی برای غربی ها بیشتر، چون برای خود ما شرقی مثلا چی گفتی نیلی؟ دوباره بگو.
این موزیک مثل یه آدم فرانسوی یا انگلیسیه که میخواد فارسی حرف بزنه.
آها، بعد لهجه داره دیگه عملا.
لهجه داره، بعدم کلماتی که استفاده میکنه شاید جمله بندیش درست هیچ ربطی به فارسی نداشته.
بعد یه دفعه میاد با کلمات ارمنی، بعد اون وسط هندی و بعد اردو و پنجابی و اینا هم داره، یه دفعه وسط عربی. So today we're going to talk about Orientalism and Orientalist music more specifically. Now, what is Orientalism? Orientalism, in its simplest definition, is the East as viewed by the zeitgeist, the hive mind of the collective pop culture of the West. It's not the East as it exists in reality. It's a fictional, alternative, exoticized version of the East that only exists in the mind of Western zeitgeist and Western culture. This image of the East amounts to a bunch of stereotypes, tropes, and cliches, and very limited ones at that. So, for example, the Orient in Orientalism has to be a desert. No other biomes can be accepted within an Orientalist view. Istanbul, which resides in a very wet, lush, green, and rainy region of the world, is often represented as a more desert-like environment. My home region of Mazandaran in northern Iran is not allowed to exist in Orientalist representations because it's a lush green forest region with snowy mountains and everything. If God forbid one day the Americans decide to have a movie set in Mazandaran, I guarantee you, in the universe of the movie, they'll turn it into a desert. They'll still have the text saying Mazandaran, northern Iran, but they'll turn it into a desert and they'll film it in Jordan or Morocco. Orientalism often takes the shape of adjusting the real East so that it conforms to the Western expectations of the East. It's the logic of Netflix's latest Alexander documentary. The Achaemenid Persians who did not have stereotypical turbans and who had straight swords, Netflix goes out of its way to give them curved scimitar swords and recognizable stereotypical turbans. You can just imagine the producers thinking to themselves, yeah, our audience is going to be confused because they're going to expect Persians to have turbans and curved swords, so better to give them things that they didn't have so that they look more Persian, even though the Persians did not look like this. Now, there's a horrifyingly condescending view that Western media tends to have of its own audiences. The idea that Western audiences are so stupid that they cannot ever readjust their preconceived notions of other cultures, and so better to just feed them the same pig feed over and over again, lest they, somehow riot over how confused they are. And of course, this creates a vicious circle of ignorance. I know many fellow Easterners who, get frustrated whenever Westerners just assume that we all live in deserts and have camels and everything. But my thing is, well, how can you blame those Westerners when that's all they've been given over and over again, the same repetitive pig feed of Orientalism? I can't really bring myself to blame most of them because of that. Of course, when we use the term the East, the definition can be very large and nebulous. Historically, you have had Orientalism for China, for Japan, but for the purposes of this video, we are going to limit the definition of Orientalism to the classical expression, the bulk of it, if you will, which is concerned with MENA, the Middle East, North Africa, the Near East, etc. Now, what is Orientalist music? Orientalist music refers to a style or styles of music devised by Western composers used in Western media to represent the East for Western audiences. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, could you give us some examples of instances of Orientalist music in Western media? And that question's premise is flawed. The question rather should be, could you give us examples of Western media that do not utilize Orientalist music? And I would have as hard of a time as finding instances of snowfall in the Sahara Desert. Now, I'm sure snowfall does occur here and there in the Sahara Desert, but you kind of get my point. Orientalist music is not an instance in Western media that happens from here to there. It's not even the statistical majority of representations of Eastern music in Western media. It is the near absolutely, near total, exclusive form of representation of Eastern music in Western media. Let me make this very clear. If you think you have an idea of Middle Eastern music in your mind, but you've never heard anything outside of Western media, then we can confidently guess with almost complete certainty that you have most probably never heard 1 second of actual Middle Eastern music in your entire life. Yes, it is this bad. You can name me any soundtrack, any film, any documentary, and I can guarantee you it is going to be Orientalist, except for very, very minor exceptions that I'm actually going to mention in this video. What about the Medieval 2 soundtrack with the Eastern Civilizations Orientalist? What about the Gladiator soundtrack when they're in Morocco Orientalist? What about the Prince of Persia soundtrack Orientalist? What about this movie Orientalist? Orientalist. 4 main principles define Orientalist music. The first of those is that Orientalist music is completely distinct from actual Middle Eastern music. This is important. Orientalist music is not European-flavored Middle Eastern music. It's not Western composers learning Middle Eastern music and adding their own twist to it. It is Western composers not bothering at all whatsoever to learn anything about Middle Eastern music theory, creating music completely within the bounds of the Western musical framework. The moment a Western musician actually learns Middle Eastern music theory and writes music using those parameters, then by definition, it ceases to be Orientalist music. The second principle is that Orientalist music is the illusion of a Middle Eastern sound to an audience that doesn't know any better by composers who achieve that through a series of quick easily achieved stereotypes that doesn't require them to actually commit to learning actual Middle Eastern music theory. The third of those principles is the hodgepodge effect. Within Orientalist music, instruments, sounds, languages are not placed within their proper anthropological and cultural and ethnic context, but instead they're used in a haphazard manner. You will have pieces of music in Orientalist music that bear the term Persian, but they'll have Indian instruments and Armenian instruments and Arabic lyrics thrown together. It's just one big Oriental mush that you just put together to create some vaguely Eastern sounding thing. And the last of those is treating the East not as a tangible anthropological reality, but rather as an intangible, abstract, exotic other. See, within the logic of Orientalism, when somebody says, I'm going to write Persian music or Persian-themed music, by that, they don't mean I'm going to literally write music about the literal Persians. They're not using the term Persian as an actual anthropological signifier of the Iranic peoples of the Iranian plateau from southwestern Iran. An Orientalist composer, when they say that I'm going to write Persian music, Persian means cobra dancing over the desert sands as the camels go through the sunset, and a seductress is, belly dancing with the veils over her eyes as, the night falls and the sands blow. This is the logic of Orientalism. Orientalism isn't actually about being interested in the actual Middle East. It's about being interested in a vibe, a vague vibe that really only exists in Western culture and hasn't actually ever really existed in the actual Middle East. Now, whenever I make new Epic Talking videos, I will end up gaining new viewers who don't know my channel, and so some may ask, well, here you are criticizing musicians that are foreign to a certain culture for inauthentically representing said culture. And yet I'm browsing your channel and here you are representing the music of so many other cultures. So how are you any better? And that's a pretty fair question to ask. Who I am is somebody who has built a channel entirely off of the back of thorough ethnomusicological research and historically informed musical practices. This is not something that's very hard for me to corroborate. You can click on virtually any one of my videos on this channel and go to the pinned comment and you will find detailed, thorough explanations on why the musical, instrumental, vocal, etc. choices have been made, why they're rooted in a certain ethnomusicological factor, and why they're representative either historically or ethnomusicologically. And perhaps most importantly, I work with people from those traditions. I'm confident in saying that my Balkanic music is authentic because I work on them with Balkanic musicians who let me know if we don't exactly do this or we do that, to the point where many arrangements of Balkanic music that I've arranged have been featured in cultural events by Balkaners themselves on the basis that they were authentic enough, that they're good enough for their own native cultural events. Twice in a row, the Natale di Roma, the birthday celebrations of the city of Rome, have featured my either historically informed reconstructions of ancient Roman music or my ancient Roman themed music that uses Roman instruments, like in front of the Colosseum with the Pantheon and everything. Again, because I work closely with the sources, with the data, and most importantly, with people from those traditions or experts of those traditions. Is the nature of my authenticity perfect on every single minute level? Probably not. But at least I can use the correct instruments for the correct culture. That much cannot even be said for Orientalist music. And here I am speaking on Middle Eastern music, as a Middle Eastern musician from a long line of Middle Eastern musicians myself. So I believe that in this regard, I am not exceedingly arrogant in this enterprise. I do think I have some level of being well-placed to speak on this subject. Third and final disclaimer, whenever I make videos in which I talk about how a certain style of music is not authentic to a time or place, the fans of these styles of music, or some of them at least, take it as a personal attack, and their interpretation of my video is, therefore you're saying we shouldn't enjoy this style of music, that we should feel bad for listening to it. You'll have a hard time finding anyone who enjoys Orientalist music more than I do, especially the old Lawrence of Arabia kind of classic Hollywood sound. I absolutely adore it. Now, while it's undeniable that Orientalist music is fundamentally rooted in the ignorance of Western musicians who don't bother actually putting in the work to understand Middle Eastern music theory, and that it's really nothing more than a bunch of lazy cliches and stereotypes, it still creates a unique sound of its own, and I enjoy that sound for what it is on its own merits. My point here is not to get anyone to stop listening to Orientalist music. I just want people to understand that whilst they may think that they've been listening to Middle Eastern music, they actually haven't been. They've been listening to something completely different. Similarly, I will be very openly critical of some YouTube channels who create Orientalist music, but I am not criticizing them because their music is Orientalist. I am going to be critical of these channels because they have not properly explained what their music is about. You see, you have this channel, for example, that creates music called Ancient Arabian Music, but their music is software-based. It doesn't use any real instruments. It uses softwares that emulate the sound of instruments, and the instruments that they're using are neither ancient nor Arabian. They're using tars that are Iranian and santurs that are Iranian and Armenian duduks, and throwing them all together. They're not even using them using Middle Eastern music theory or the Middle Eastern musical language, and they just call it Ancient Arabian Music and don't offer any context beyond that. Well, the average person is going to look at that and say, okay, that's what ancient Arabian music sounded like. The most popular examples of Middle Eastern and Arabic music on the internet, if you type Arabian and Middle Eastern music on the internet, the first results you're going to get are from this channel. A collection of music by two Westerners who don't know a single thing about Middle Eastern music theory, who use second-rate softwares instead of actual real Middle Eastern instruments, mixing Iranian and Indian and Armenian instruments in their supposedly Arabic music, and they call it Arabic and Middle Eastern music. I'm not criticizing them for having created Orientalist music. I'm criticizing them for not having promoted it as Orientalist music. I'm advocating for the idea that Orientalism should be an option available to composers. However, as we have established previously, it's not an option. Historically, Orientalist music has been the exclusive norm in Western media. I am not critical of the existence of Orientalism, nor do I wish for its eradication. All I'm advocating for is that in a normal world, a balance of often having actual Middle Eastern music implemented in representations of the Middle East, and from time to time, if composers for a specific aesthetic decide that Orientalism would better serve that purpose, I don't think that's too radical a stance. I have no problem with people listening to Orientalist music and enjoying it on the basis of its artistry. I do have a problem when thousands upon thousands, if not millions of people, as evidenced in the comments of these YouTube videos, listen to Orientalist music, thanking those composers for having given them a glimpse of the actual real musical tradition of the Middle East. The duduk. The duduk has developed a fetishistic obsession on the parts of Western composers and video game composers of Hollywood and everything when it comes to any soundtrack that has anything to do remotely with MENA or the Middle East. You have documentaries about Morocco and it'll use the duduk. You'll have shots of Arabic countries and it'll use the duduk for some reason. I just need you to understand how literal I am being. I'm not exaggerating. Literally every single Western film that is remotely connected to the East uses the duduk. Literally. I'm not kidding. You can listen to any soundtrack. They all use the duduk, literally, systematically. It is obsessive on the parts of Western composers. Absolutely obsessive. The duduk is an Armenian instrument, and its geographical usage was always very, very limited. It bled over the direct geographical neighbors of that region, so it's pretty much always been limited to the Caucasus, the Armenian highlands, Azerbaijan, and, the Eastern Anatolians. That's pretty much it when it comes to the geographical spread of the duduk. But because of the fetishistic, systematic usage of the duduk in Orientalist music and Western media, people now have gotten this idea that this is the great ultimate Oriental instrument. You want to make music about Iran, use the duduk. And it's just very weird to hear people call it the Arabic instrument when not a single one of the Arab cultures uses it, not a single one. It used to be that the orchestral ensemble with, the double harmonic major and everything was what Orientalist music was mostly about. Orientalism shifted towards using actual instruments from the Eastern modal traditions, but using them in a haphazard way that is not at all representative of their actual ethnic and cultural and national associations. So modern Orientalist music will use Indian instruments for Arabic countries and an Armenian instrument for Moroccan music.
At my signal, unleash hell.
This movie moves around a little bit geographically. What I wanted to do is, once we're in Morocco, I wanted it to be really tribal, dirty, gritty. I always wanted to use this one instrument for the Moroccan sequences called the duduk, which is thousands of years old. It's really an Armenian clarinet, would be the easiest explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Morocco, you say Morocco, I think Armenian instrument. Yeah, 100%. Armenia, Caucasus, Asia, therefore, 6,000 kilometers away from there, at the edge of Africa, in another continent. Oh my God, Faria, you just speak so pedantic and you just speak such a snowflake. It still fits. It's still appropriate. It's still Eastern. It's still, you people, it's still, brown. That's kind of the entire point of the thing. Yeah, in this movie, for the scenes that are set in Paris, I've used the sound of a Cretan madura. What the fuck? This is so weird. Why are you doing this? It's so jarring. Why are you doing this? This doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound Parisian. Oh my God, you're overreacting so much. Okay, it's still a European instrument. It still fits. It's still completely appropriate. You're still in Europe. They're all white. It's still really the same thing. It's just Europe. How much of a difference is there between a Scottish person and a Sicilian person? It's literally all the same at the end, isn't it? I don't want to shit too much on Hans Zimmer. I'm happy he used the duduk for that section of the movie. However, I have to recognize, with pure honesty, despite the fact that I'm the biggest fanboy of this soundtrack, it is my favorite film soundtrack of all time, probably. I just have to recognize that, anthropologically speaking, it is quite funny and absurd to hear the duduk in Morocco. And the hard truth and the hard pill to swallow, I think, for a lot of people, is that if Western audiences knew just as much about Morocco and Armenia as they did Scotland, Hans Zimmer would not be able to get away with this, because he certainly would never be able to get away with this movie. This is unimaginable in Western media. Orientalism is all about getting away with the generalized ignorance that Western audiences in general have towards the Eastern civilization. See, they're not sufficiently familiar enough with the musical cultures of the Middle East to be able to place a certain instrument within its proper anthropological context. Let me give you an example. If I play this instrument, the average Western person, however musically illiterate, will be able to tell you that, well, this is an older kind of instrument. It sounds kind of royal and palacey, and I imagine aristocrats dancing to this. And it's definitely not a hillbilly instrument used by Appalachian rednecks, stereotypically. But if I start using the banjo, on the other hand, the average Westerner is able to tell that this is clearly not some royal instruments used by the ancient royalty of Europe. This is the banjo. It's like a folk American thing. However, on the other hand, I'll play this instrument. The average Westerner who doesn't know anything about the Eastern modal traditions, they can't tell whether this is Iranian or Turkish or Armenian or all of them, whether this is a low-class, folkish villager instrument or whether this is a more high-class instrument, whether it's liturgical or not. So, for example, with this piece of music, Faulan, Princess of Persia, these percussions are completely out of place because they lean very much towards a geographically Southeast Asian usage. Different regions have their own percussions that have their own color and sound that defines the characteristic sound of said culture. So, for example, for Persian music or Iranian music at large, you want to use a tumbak. about the main two percussions that we use, especially the daf and the tombak. The daf and the tombak sound completely different from these percussions. As somebody from the region, hearing these Southeast Asian leaning percussions over supposedly Iranian music is equivalent to hearing this over something that is supposed to have a Scottish theme. It's just completely jarring. If you want an Arabic or Greek or Turkish sound, the darbuka drum is what you'd most probably use. That is the most commonly used type of instrument there. And for Southeast Asians, it's that kind of sound. But this kind of sound automatically screams India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Desi cultures, rather than actual Middle Eastern cultures, certainly not the Persian culture. And then, of course, the duduk. We can't go without the duduk. The duduk is the one. It is the main one. That is the obsessive one. Then you have this comment that the musicians themselves wrote, which is, "Dear community, we are very happy that so many people like this song. It means a lot to us that the song seems to touch the depth of the soul of many people. That is exactly what we want to achieve with our songs. Touch the heart and take you into another world." We read attentively every comment and apologized to all Persian people that we called the song Princess of Persia, although it belongs more to Arabic music. To be honest, we don't write music according to a certain style of music, but we let ourselves be driven by our thoughts. That's how the song was created. Yeah, and that's exactly my point about Orientalist music. Orientalist music is not driven by any research or emulation of cultures or anthropological reality. It's Westerners who don't really know anything about the Middle East and Middle Eastern cultures, and they just heard certain instruments in Hollywood films and they associate that with a vibe, and they're just going with, I just wanted a vibe of the desert. What's really funny is, in this mea culpa, then they're writing, although it belongs more to Arabic music. No, it doesn't even belong to Arabic music. This is not Arabic music. It has Southeast Asian percussions. It has a duduk. Even when they're trying to correct themselves, they show that no anthropological awareness or knowledge whatsoever. Santur. The santur is principally used in Iran. It is really an Iranian instrument. Even countries that use the santur, such as Turkey, such as Indians also have a different kind of santur. The Greeks also saduri. They have a different type of saduri. But even those countries agree that like the santur has a central place in Iranian music that no other musical tradition confers that to it. The most un-Arabic instrument you could imagine is the santur. Hearing a santur over a title that says ancient Arabian music, it would feel like this to a Westerner.
Got me a woman in the Cumberland Gap. Got me a woman in the Cumberland Gap. Got me a woman in the Cumberland Gap. She's got a boy that calls me Pap.
Okay, I just absolutely adore this one. Do you hear it? Down. That's like a tapura kind of instrument. I don't know. It's clearly a digital VST, but it is emulating some sort of, this kind of buzzing kind of instrument sound. This is Southeast Asian. Okay, this is Indian. Iranians, we don't have anything that sounds like this. I mean, the Arabs, for God's sake, how ignorant can you be of Arabic music? It's like this.
Got me a woman in the Cumberland Gap. Got me a woman in the Cumberland Gap.
Another example would be the Crusader Kings 3 Legacy of Persia soundtrack. It begins as just generic Orientalist music. Duduk. We're not even 8 seconds into the fucking song, and there's a duduk already.
Mr. Hollywood composer, your son was boiled alive, and your wife died of grief. Your entire city burned down. Also, you can't use the duduk for your next soundtrack in the Middle East.
Yeah, and then you have these, the desert vocals. Again, double harmonic major or Phrygian dominant, one of those two. They're almost the same mode. And the vocal style is very tense, very high pitched and nasal, which is very much unlike Persian classical vocals. Persian classical vocals are defined almost in contrast to Arabic classical vocals in that they are very much held back. They don't use a very tense vocal texture. If anything, it's a very relaxed, warm vocal texture. And you never sort of, bring out the voice completely. You never like let it explode out. It's always held back a little bit.
سل الرماح العوالي عن معالينا واستشهد البيضة الخبر رجا فينا
پیر 12 امامم شراب من خونه یزید
جدك الغيث إذا الغيث حما يا زمانا واسلبي الأندلسي غلاش والخلق يرزقني اللهم صل على المصطفى
Yazmayı da sarıya mı boyadın? Başındaki yazmayı da sarıya mı boyadın? Snalivada trava zelena Rosnalivada aman aman trava zelena
ستاره آسمون نقش زمینه وای خدا من گشتر و یارم نگینه
This vocal style is not something that is representative of how we sing in Iran. One of those musicians made a piece of music called At the Gates of Babylon, epic Persian music, and then he remasters it, the exact same song, still called At the Gates of Babylon, but this time it's epic Arabian music. It's the exact same song. Like it's like on display. The guy just doesn't, they're all the same. Persians are Arabs, their music sounds the same. Persian Egyptian music. Yeah, one of my favorite genres. I also love Estonian Scottish music and Danish Greek music. Also some of my favorite music. The guy doesn't use Persian and Egyptian literally. The title is literally someone going, Persian Egyptian, two words that kind of vaguely mean Eastern, Oriental, whatever, Egyptian, Persian, you get it. It's the equivalent of me making a weird mishmash of like flamenco vocals with Scottish music and calling it Belgian Lithuanian music with the implicit semiotic gesture that, you know what I mean, Belgian Lithuania, you get it, you know what I mean, those people, the fucking, Europe, the whites, Eiffel Tower, those people, Belgian, Lithuanian, whatever, you get the vibe. Ancient Egyptian music / Persian music, Desert Duduk. Short Arabian-inspired track by me. My dude, ancient Egypt isn't Arabian, Persian isn't Arabian, and the Duduk isn't Arabian. Literally everything about this makes no fucking sense. Within Orientalism, whenever somebody uses the term Scottish, they mean it literally, as in literally anthropologically the Scots. If they use the term Russian or if they use the term Greek, they mean it in a literal manner. But Orientalists, the way they use Egyptian and Persian, they don't mean it in a literal anthropological sense, they mean it in a vague signifier of a vibe.
As the title indicates, this song is a desert, Arabic, Persian-themed song.
Yeah, there's a piece of music I wrote in a French, Hungarian, temperate climate-themed kind of music. Yeah, desert-themed music. Alpine climate music also. Alpine climate. Whew, big fan. Do you see how absurd this kind of approach becomes the moment you try to apply it to Europe? Suddenly, the almost offensive levels of generalization and ignorance come to the surface. There is something a little bit disturbing, I think, about somebody from that region myself, as an Iranian myself, to see that terms associated with my identity are reduced to nothing more than a bunch of
vague vibes to denote simplistic stereotypes and cliches in the minds of outsiders. The very first epic talking video that I made, Are Iranian and Arabic Music the Same?, was mainly about the mixed race effect. Now, the mixed race effect is this psychological phenomenon wherein, as human beings, when we've interacted a lot with a category, we have an easy time distinguishing the individual members of that category apart from one another. But the moment we start looking at another category that we're not familiar with, we initially kind of mix them all together, the individual elements, and we have a hard time telling them apart. This inherent psychological limitation of human beings partially explains why Chinese people, for example, who have not spent a lot of time looking at white phenotypes, will tell you all white people kind of look alike, but the moment you tell them all Asians look alike, they go, are you crazy? Or it's why, for example, people who speak Slavic languages will tell you with utter confidence that Russian and Polish sound completely different from one another. But somebody who really doesn't know anything about Slavic languages and who hasn't heard many of them, most of them will tend to tell you, I don't know, like to me Polish and Russian sound the exact same and I cannot tell them apart for the life of me. This psychological limitation is more than natural to human beings. It is inherent to who we are. And it's perfectly normal that the collective consciousness of the West has that in regards to the East. Of course, the West will be more intimately familiar with its own direct neighbors and cultural relatives. This is why to most Westerners, if I say, are Polish and Spanish cultures different, they're like, what do you mean they're different? Of course, they're nothing alike. It's almost like on a gut level, you feel that they're different. But the moment I tell them, how about Iranian and Arab, suddenly they have a hard time and they often can't tell them apart, again, unless they've actually interacted and studied those cultures. Now, what happens when you put the representation of the Orient into the hands of people who have the inherent limitation, who haven't looked a lot at the East and therefore perceive the East as one interchangeable mush? You're going to get a representation of the East that's one interchangeable mush, and you're going to get people going, whatever, a duduk fits in Morocco, it's all the same anyway. I personally cannot for the life of me tell Chinese and Japanese architecture apart from one another. I look at them and I'm like, as far as I'm concerned, they're the exact same thing. However, I am cognizant of the fact that if I spend more time looking at that architecture and studying it, I will be able to tell that they are as individually distinct from one another as German architecture is distinct from French architecture, a distinction that I can very easily make because I have spent more time looking at European architecture. Having the mixed race effect is perfectly fine. That makes us human. But dismissing other cultures on the basis that I can't tell the difference, therefore you are overreacting, that's not being human. That's being a fucking cunt. Orientalism thrives on and is literally fueled, exists solely and primarily due to the generalized ignorance of mass audiences regarding foreign cultures. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to write a piece of music in an Orientalistic manner. So the first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to make a piece of music about the ancient Persian Empire. And so I want that Persian sound. So I'm going to use an instrument that like sounds Eastern. It has that like Eastern, like, you know, like that, you know, Middle Eastern, like Arabic kind of thing, because it's the Persian Empire. So we want that kind of Arabic sound. Oh yeah, that's good. That it has like that Arabic like thing. That has like, that sounds Persian. There's this thing, like this instrument. It's like that the Middle Eastern like desert thing, like in all the movies. It's called the duduk. Like that is so Persian, desert, because that's the thing. I want to make a piece of music about, I want to make a Persian piece of music, and Persian music is about getting like that Arab, you know, like desert kind of vibe, you know, like that, like you want that vibe, you know, the camel, you know, the Allahu Akbar, tribal, you know, primitive. That's it. We've got Persian music on our hands, guys.
الضحكة الجميلة يا حياة
am going to write a piece of music that is supposedly going to be European in nature with the same kind of method that Orientalist Western musicians use for Middle Eastern cultures. So we are going to make a piece of music called William Wallace Epic Scottish Battle Music. I want that Scottish vibe, you know, that European vibe. You know what I mean? This instrument, I want that instrument too, because we want like that authentic, you know, like Western kind of feel. So we're gonna use this one. I hear that instrument and I think of like Scotland and everything. And then for the vocals, I want that vocal style, you know, that like the Europeans use in their music. This one. This opera, whatever, I don't fucking care. Like that vocal style, it's gonna give us that Western. Oh, and then this instrument, the Western instrument, this one. Hear this and you're like, William Wallace. Yeah, and then I want that way of singing that they have, like the Europeans. What are they called? The alcoholics, the vodka people, whatever. They're all fucking Europeans anyway. It doesn't really matter. Europeans have this style of singing.
Dali ke mezeme mamo iline mezima.
Yeah, because like I hear it and it just makes me think of like Charlemagne, William the Conqueror, like, because it's European. William Wallace, epic Scottish Western music.
Ididago sakash mamo tovaten kozore.
I hope that this has been a fruitful exercise in empathy. I understand, I sympathize with the fact that if you're not a Middle Easterner and you listen to Orientalist music, you might be thinking to yourself, I don't know, it works fine for me. It's not like this absurd, jarring thing. Well, yeah, it isn't, because you don't have the empirical knowledge required in order to have the perceptual experience that actual Easterners have. But I need you to understand, this William Wallace example that I created is not an exaggeration. It is literally how Orientalist music sounds like to us. That same level of completely nonsensical mixing of cultures and everything is literally how it works within Orientalism. And this opens up an interesting philosophical notion. You're dealing with a form of artistic expression that works for everybody except the people that it represents. A form of art that is jarring only to the people that it represents. Food for thought. First and foremost, among all the features of Orientalist music, its beating heart, the beating drum at the core of all of it, the main crutch of Orientalist music, is the over-reliance on the double fucking harmonic major. It's very recognizable, and it is the go-to series of notes to refer to the East and to the Orient in the minds of people. In order to understand why it's such a stereotype, we have to understand the nature of the Eastern modal traditions. We call these traditions the Eastern modal traditions because modality and the usage of modes is their primary factor. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail of what a mode is. I will tell you to go watch this video in which I explain in more detail what modes are. Basically, to keep it very simple for this video, a mode is a specific configuration of notes. If you look at a piano and you use this specific configuration, this specific selection of notes, it gives you the major. This specific configuration, the minor Dorian. This specific configuration, the minor Aeolian. And then by the end of the Middle Ages, you have the rise of the harmonic minor, and you have a few others, but for the most part, European music in its mainstream was limited to minor, major, and like two or three others, so upwards of five basically at most. Again, in the mainstream, I know there have been experimentals, I know about Harry Partch and everything. We're talking about mainstream generalities of Western music for most of its history. On the other hand, the Eastern modal traditions are all about having in each tradition 30 modes, 40 modes, 50 modes. That's why they're called the Eastern modal traditions, because it's having so many modes that is the literal defining trait. This is helped, of course, by the fact that we have more notes than Westerners do. Westerners, since the Middle Ages, have divided the octave in 12 parts. They've spliced the octave into 12 notes. We splice it into more than 12 notes, at least 24. That's what we call microtonality. So the moment you have more notes, this exponentially expands the configurations that you can have. Now you have even more configuration. So basically, the Eastern modal traditions are all about having many, 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 many modes. The great strength of Middle Eastern music, its greatest quality, its greatest achievement, the thing that makes it what it is the fact that it has so many modes, such a diversity of modes, from Rast to Sigah to Bayat, all these different modes, some of them microtonal. That means Westerners can't even play them. Westerners don't even know how to sing them without proper training, because these are notes that literally do not exist in Western music theory. And within this panoply of so many different modes, there is one tetrachord, this tetrachord, which is the basis for a mode called Hijaz and its close parent, Hijazkar. You also have the Phrygian, and the Phrygian and Hijazkar are two modes that have become the go-to representatives of the East in Orientalist music. Orientalist music has a fetishistic obsession with this Hijaz tetrachord and with the Phrygian mode. Orientalist music is defined by the fact that it cannot even conceive of Middle Eastern music beyond the usage of the double harmonic major. The entirety of the vast panoply of so many different modes used by the Eastern modal traditions is boiled down to this one single fucking singular mode of double harmonic major. Hello, Mr. Hollywood/video game music composer. I was sent here to be your consultant on Middle Eastern music. So I just wanted to know, so the first scene for the movie, how does the melody go? I wanted the music to sound Middle Eastern, so the melody goes like this. Okay, interesting choice. Hijaz, yeah, the Hijaz tetrachord, sure. That's a mode that we have. It's heard relatively often in our music. Kind of a specific mode to choose. It's not really a central one, but it is there. We do use it, so sure. How about the next scene, the scene after that, when the hero meets the girl? Okay, Hijazkar again. That's interesting. How about, if I may, I could suggest to you different modes of Middle Eastern music, because as you know, the entire point of Middle Eastern music is that we are the musical tradition with the most modes. Like, that's literally what our musical tradition is about, right? So, for example, you could go for Bayat or Shur. That is the most widely used traditional mode. It's the minor, but the second note of the minor scale is a half flat, a microtonal half flat. So it goes like this. Hear that sound? It's never heard in Western music, and it gives it a beautiful sound. You can go. I could go like that, but I'd rather go like this. Sure. You can just stick to Hijaz Kar for this one too if you want. Now for the next scene, what would be interesting, I would suggest going for a variant of shur. It gives you a minor flavor, but that's not quite minor, and it's not quite like shur or bayat that we just saw, so it goes like this. It's almost the Western minor, but aye, but I think I'll rather go like this. Okay, Hijaz Kar again. How about this one could be interesting. This is a microtonal mode that is really, really microtonal. Hear that? It's almost like you can't put your finger on whether it's happy at some moments, but then it goes like dark. Like here it's... It sounds kind of happy, but then you go down the... Aye, or I could just go like this. I don't get it. You're dealing with a musical tradition that has the most modes out of any other, and you just what is your fetish with this one mode? Yes, Hijaz Kar and the double harmonic major exist, but not to the degree where people think. People have now gotten this idea outside of the Middle East that all of our music is based in Hijaz Kar and everything, and they hear Hijaz Kar and double harmonic major, and they go, oh, it sounds Egyptian and deserty, thinking that this is the main factor of our music. This is the equivalent of going to Italy and being like, oh yeah, Italian cuisine. Oatmeal. You know that oatmeal is the Italian cuisine thing. It's ridiculous. Now, of course, they do have oatmeal. They eat oatmeal in their food. It would be so strange and weird for oatmeal, for some reason, to mistakenly be perceived by non-Italians as the go-to representative of Italian cuisine and culture. It's just kind of weird. And somebody once said to me, he's like, well, you know, Hijaz Kar is like pizza. Pizza is also an Italian stereotype. I'm like, no, it's not an Italian stereotype. The Italians do promote pizza as their national dish. Now, of course, it's stereotypical that they eat nothing but pizza. There's many dishes outside of pizza, but pizza is their national central dish along with spaghetti and many others. Whereas, if you start listening to Iranian music, you may go through 10 hours of Iranian music before you finally hear that fucking Hijaz tetrachord. You will hear literally the major scale more often. We use the major scale, we have it in the Middle East, and we use it way more often than we use this goddamn mode. I need this to be absolutely clear. When I say that the Orientalist music is obsessed, absolutely fetishistically obsessed with the double harmonic major and the Phrygian mode, like exclusively those two, and never, ever, ever any other Middle Eastern modes, ever, never. Like it is, I'm dead ass. It's at this level, it's that bad. You will never, ever hear any Middle Eastern mode outside of these two, Phrygian and double harmonic major. You have the hours upon hours of Arabian music and Middle Eastern music that the Fischer brothers have written on YouTube. And their music, by the way, a lot of it is very beautiful. It harkens to that old Hollywood sound. Literally, you can listen to all their hours of music. It's literally just Phrygian and double harmonic major. Literally. They never venture outside of that even once. Any of those epic Arabic battle music, Arabian battle music, World Music FM, Antti Martikainen, Adrian von Ziegler, all of them, double harmonic major Phrygian, Harry Gregson Williams, double harmonic Phrygian, Hans Zimmer, double harmonic Phrygian, you name any composer, it's that bad. It's not a case of, oh, it's that bad. Orientalist music can literally not conceive of Western music outside of only those two. It reduces the musical tradition with the largest amount of modes in the combined history of humankind to only two, and really mostly one, which is the double harmonic major, and then secondarily the Phrygian mode. You have like 100 others, and you just go for this one over and over again when you have so many other different sounds and emotions. And why this one mode? We're gonna look at why right now. Orientalist music is written by Westerners who don't know Middle Eastern music theory. If they knew Middle Eastern music theory, then it wouldn't be Orientalist music. And their goal is to create a form of music that automatically sounds exotic and foreign and alien and Eastern to their mainstream Western audience. That's easy to do with the Middle Eastern modes because most of them are microtonal. Microtonality does not exist in Western music theory. Microtonal modes are so alien and unusual from a Western perspective. That you can automatically get that foreign, alien, exotic vibe that Orientalism needs. So why don't these Orientalist musicians use microtonality? 3 reasons. The first is that they are Western trained musicians, and somebody who is exclusively trained in Western music theory doesn't know how to use microtonality. Now, I know a lot of Western trained musicians who think they understand microtonality, and they're a lot like Italian Americans who think they're Italians. And whenever they come to us Middle Easterners and try to prove that they understand microtonality, it's like that cringe moment when you see Italian Americans trying to show to Italians that they're just as Italians as them. Western music theory is literally antithetical to microtonality in its very fundamentals, whereas Middle Eastern music is literally rooted entirely in the usage of microtonality. The second reason is because most Western trained musicians tend to detest the sound of microtonality. It's so off-putting to them that they don't even want to use it in the first place because it just sounds so bad to their ears. And the third reason is because most Western instruments cannot even accommodate the usage of microtonality. Guitars and everything, for example, do not have enough frets in order for you to be able to play microtonal notes. Basically, it all amounts to they're Western musicians, and because Western music theory is so antithetical to microtonality, well, they're not going to use it because they don't even know how to use it, they don't like the sound of it, and even if they wanted to use it, their instruments do not allow them to use it. So microtonality is out of the picture. It's not a possibility. So what do? There are modes in the Middle East that the Westerners also have. See, every mode that exists in Western music also exists in Middle Eastern music theory. We have the major scale, we have the minor scale, we have every scale that exists in Western music theory, we have it in the East too. So why don't they use those? Well, the problem is, because those modes are also used in the West, it's way harder to get them to sound exotic and foreign. In order to make a major scale melody sound foreign and exotic, you really need to know a lot about the accent with which Middle Eastern instruments are played. You need to learn how those instruments are articulated. But again, because they're Western musicians limited to Western music theory, they don't know how to articulate instruments in a Middle Eastern manner, and so even if they try writing modes that Westerners also have, it just ends up sounding like Western music. Somebody who grew up in Eastern modal music theory can easily take a melody in the Dorian minor, something that is as Western as it gets, and make it sound completely Middle Eastern, like Severin Ben Seni, which for the most part is often played in a very, very close analog to the Dorian mode of Western music. This requires effort. It requires an amount of effort to learn those authentic articulations and techniques and to get that sound out. So the modes that are accessible to Westerners, because they're classically Western modes also, are also out of the picture. So what are you left with? You're left with Phrygian, and most importantly, the double harmonic major. Double harmonic major and Phrygian are not microtonal modes. Therefore, they're easy to be played on Western instruments, and also they don't exist in Western music at all. Therefore, the moment you use the double harmonic major tetrachord, even without Eastern instruments, even without any knowledge of their ornaments and techniques and their way of playing, you will automatically get a foreign sound. Simply because they don't have that in the West, therefore it'll automatically sound exotic and foreign and otherworldly. And it has the added advantage of not being microtonal, therefore easily accessible on Western instruments. This is why the double harmonic major and the Phrygian to a secondary extent have become the ultimate crutch without which Orientalist music cannot survive. Because Orientalist music will never dare even try to make an effort to understand the vast, incredibly deep complexity of the Eastern modal traditions. The reason the double harmonic major has become the main pillar of Orientalist music is simply because it is a fast, cheap cheat code that doesn't require any effort whatsoever. I can just go up and down this tetrachord over and over again on a piano without putting in any effort understanding how their instruments are played, the techniques, the ornamentations, the music theory, and it'll already sound Middle Eastern and exotic just like that.
Now, there are many criticisms that can be levied against Hollywood soundtracks and Hollywood composers. They write from a Western music theory framework, they completely ignore and can't be bothered to go into actual Middle Eastern music theory, so they stick only to double harmonic major and Phrygian. You know, they mishmash instruments in a nonsensical, stereotypical way. However, one thing can be given to them: they use real instruments at least. Usually they'll get real Armenian duduk players to play melodies that, still end up sounding Orientalist because they constrain those Middle Eastern musicians within a Western musical framework, within Orientalist melodies that are not written the way Eastern melodies would be written, but at least the instruments are real. The same cannot be said, however, for this YouTube Orientalist genre, this whole epic Arabic battle music, Persian battle music, ancient Egyptian duduk kind of music on YouTube that has unfortunately become the dominant form of representation of Eastern music on YouTube. If you type Middle Eastern and Egyptian music on YouTube, the first examples are going to be from Western Orientalists who don't know anything about Middle Eastern music theory. And the worst part is, most of them have never put their hands on an actual Middle Eastern instrument in their lives. Their music, this whole genre, is entirely and completely software based. You don't need to believe me, they themselves list all the softwares that they've used. This, coupled with their complete disinterest in actually delving into actual Eastern music theory, their reliance on Western music theory, on stereotypes, on cultural mishmash of instruments, explains why their music sounds the way it does. Because a physical instrument allows you to articulate the instrument in many ways, but a software can only go so far. And that's what we're going to look at right now. The problem of articulation, or the lack of articulation, really.
Articulation is the way you use a certain instrument. The violin is a great example of that. The violin is one of the most versatile instruments to exist. Depending on how it is played, it can give you a typically Irish sound, or it can give you a typically Middle Eastern sound. Those are the same instrument, but the way that they're articulated confers that ethnic grit to it. And in order to understand articulation with instruments, you have to be used to a certain culture. The way cultures play their instruments creates different effects. This is why the balama, which historically was played by the Greeks for a few centuries before they went out of fashion recently, when the Greeks play the balama, it sounds very different from how the Turks play it. Articulation is an important detail of ethnic authenticity that requires study and familiarity. I was working on a piece of music recently where I asked a musician to record the duduk for me. However, when I asked the musician to play the duduk for me, I said, it's an Azerbaijani themed piece of music. And he said, okay, so I will play it with an Azerbaijani accent. This is something that is completely lost on musicians like Antti Martikainen and everything. And the way that they articulate their instruments, they just go up and down the double harmonic major scale. If you know anything about actual Middle Eastern music, it's that what defines our way of playing music is primarily the ornamentation. Ornamentation is not even ornament. I dislike the term ornamentation when speaking about Middle Eastern music because our music isn't ornamented. The ornamentation is the music. If you listen to Iranian piano styles of playing music, it sounds a lot more like this. Think of the Baroque era. For those who are more familiar with Western music, if you listen to old Baroque recordings, all those ornamentations and everything. Composers, what they do, they buy those virtual instruments, Middle Eastern instruments, and they're just, oh, okay, Middle Eastern sounding instruments, and it says tar, sure, and then they start doing shit like this, like. It takes on a completely different dimension of its own. And it's this dimension of articulation that allows Middle Eastern music to sound Middle Eastern even when it's using modes that the Westerners are using. You can use the major fucking scale. And make it sound Middle Eastern if you know how to articulate instruments in a Middle Eastern manner.
YouTube Orientalist genre exclusively uses softwares, no real instruments. This music claims to represent a musical tradition whose primary form of expression is complex articulation, and it produces this music using softwares, a tool that can't even produce basic articulation.
Now the question must be asked, how did the duduk end up becoming the go-to Orientalist instrument to represent all of the Middle East? Well, the reason is simple. This is due to the circular associations of pop culture. Pop culture will develop associations and will refer to those same associations. This is something that is extremely important to understand. Orientalism is never rooted in emulating the actual traditions of the East. Orientalism is rooted in emulating previous incarnations of Orientalism. I would know because I was asked multiple times to compose projects for documentaries or independent video games, small short films, nothing on the scale of Hollywood, obviously, but the same cultural reflexes apply. And whenever I was asked to do that, they would tell me, can you write Iranian music for us? And I'm like, sure. And I deliver them a soundtrack that's actually Iranian. And, the first few times I did this, every time it was like, what is this? That's not what we wanted. I'm like, what do you mean? You wanted Iranian music? That's Iranian music. And they were like, no, that's not Iranian music. That's Iranian music. That's what we wanted. We wanted you to write, like, you know, Persian soundtrack music. Like, why doesn't it sound like the Prince of Persia soundtrack? Now, whenever somebody asks me to write a supposedly Iranian-themed soundtrack, I actually tell them, first off, I want you to realize that what you probably think, what you're probably asking me to do is not what is actually Iranian music. People have this idea that when Hollywood composers are tasked with writing a soundtrack about a foreign culture, that their first reference is to go out there and study the actual music of those cultures. No. Hollywood soundtracks and video game soundtracks, their first reference is previous soundtracks. Orientalism always refers to previous incarnations of Orientalism. For example, in my previous video where I talked about the duduk and how it is closely related to Rome also in Western media. So the duduk, by the way, in Western media has a dual association of anything desert ancient and also for some reason like classical Rome, I think because of Gladiator. And then a lot of people were like, well, I think Hans Zimmer used the duduk because he wanted to emulate the sound of the Greco-Roman aulos. So why didn't he use the aulos? I'm sure that the moment I say that the duduk is used in Kingdom of Heaven and it doesn't actually belong there, somebody's going to be like, well, you know, Kingdom of Heaven features Salahuddin, and Salahuddin was Kurdish, and the Kurds in Eastern Anatolia, they use the duduk. Therefore, this is what brought Harry Gresham Williams to use the duduk. I mean, we are to expect that Hollywood, with its track record of cultural representation, somehow has the most historically informed, ethnomusicologically informed instruments on such a level that they're using these third-level associations that require ethnomusicological knowledge. Bulgarian choirs were used in Troy because the composer thought it sounded ancient and cool and whatever. The duduk is constantly used because that's the Western Media Association. That's all there is to it. I'm sorry to break it to fanboys of Hollywood soundtracks. This is how Orientalism started. How Orientalism started was that somewhere in the 1800s probably, Westerners who were naturally ignorant about a foreign culture began haphazardly representing that culture without truly understanding what it is. And then the next generation of people who want to refer to the East, well, they're immersed in Western culture. So what they have access to is Western representations of the East. So they just refer to that, and on it goes. Western media always refers to previous incarnations of the East in Western media instead of actually breaking that vicious circle and going outside and actually looking at the East. This is why Orientalism has survived to this day.
یه لحظه گوش بده کارم و بهم بگو اگه به نظر تو حالت ایرانی داره یا نه. همون اولین ثانیه‌اش اون تنبک باز سطح قشنگ آدم رنگ ایرانی رو حس میکنه. آره یعنی تو مثلا اون قبلی ها رو فرستاده بودم حس میکردیم هر دو تامون که این آدما اصلا هیچ ریشه‌ای ندارن تو موسیقی خود سنتی یا اصلا کلا شرقی مدال یا ایرانی. حتی این آدم حس میکنه که کاملا از یه بیس ایرانی شروع کرده موسیقیشو بنویسه.
A Westerner wrote and made this.
One of my favorite passages in the Medieval 2 Total War soundtrack by Jeff Van Dyke, one of my favorite composers, somebody who very much, goes for Orientalist stereotypes and tropes, still has this passage. I mean, this is absolutely perfect. This is flawless. You would absolutely hear this in Egyptian classical music, for example. It's some microtonal mode. I don't know exactly what mode it is, but it is definitely microtonal. And it is being played on those portamento strings that give it that very recognizable Middle Eastern string kind of quality. And it sounds literally out of something that you would hear Fairuz singing, for example. It's absolutely perfect. It's brilliant. Now, the thing is, the rest of the soundtrack very much goes for Orientalist tropes and everything, but my point is, Orientalism is a spectrum. And earlier we were talking about the Crusader Kings DLC soundtrack. absolutely perfect. This is Persian classical music. This is literally Persian classical music. You have a santur articulated generously with ornamentation and everything. You have a microtonal melody. You have a tar joining in, and you have a tombak drum. Literally everything about this is perfect, absolutely perfect. Of course, the composer says that he collaborated with Iranian musicians, and I am of the opinion, I'm just gonna guess that the more Orientalist sounding parts of the soundtrack are more the composer's work, and all of this was him pretty much just letting his Iranian team loose. Edgar, puis tu m'avais envoyé genre un morceau à un moment donné. T'étais comme écoute, j'ai composé de quoi dans un style iranien. Puis j'ai écouté ça, puis j'étais comme wow, Chris, y'a pas de doudouk, c'est pas la double harmonique majeure, c'est pas orientaliste et tout. Comment t'as fait pour être aussi authentique que ça, que moi, un Iranien, j'étais comme hey Chris, c'est iranien.
D'abord, merci beaucoup. C'est vraiment juste en écouter le plus possible. Ouais. Tu fais un copy-paste, de copier le plus possible, d'être le plus accurate possible. Genre. Tu fais ça un bout de temps, puis après ça, tu développes ton propre son, tes propres twists à toi, personnellement. C'est un des Daskal, mettons, je connais, mettons, j'avais étudié les notes des modes eux-mêmes, les différentes fonctions, mettons, ça c'est la tonique, mettons, ça finaliste. D'ailleurs, comme une des pièces que je suis en train de faire d'ailleurs, mettons, on est en Sega, puis ça c'est la root, ça c'est la quinte, mettons. La quinte, elle peut varier d'un quart de ton, tu sais.
Ouais.
Fait que, mettons, je pourrais faire comme... mettons. Ça, avec la théorie, justement, j'ai appris qu'on pouvait twister la note, mettons, de ça à ça, genre.
Ouais.
D'un quart de ton.
Je pense qu'il y en a qui diraient que genre, oh non, mais là, t'en demandes trop aux compositeurs occidentaux, il y a personne qui peut écrire de la musique iranienne comme un Iranien, et puis bullshit aussi, genre, je pense que c'est pas vrai. C'est pas vrai, c'est faisable, faut juste s'appliquer, genre. C'est tellement nice parce que un des chapitres importants dans la vidéo, là, c'est l'importance de l'articulation. Peux-tu nous expliquer comment, en fait, tu utilises ton doigt, genre?
Ouais, j'utilise mon doigt, je laisse légèrement l'ongle pousser, puis dans le fond, c'est vraiment le setup. Traditionnellement, si tu utilises, c'est comme, tu gardes tes mains de même, puis tu fais juste bouger ton index de même. Fait que moi, j'ai comme repris ça un peu, là. Puis j'ai modifié mon sas aussi pour que, justement, ça soit pas doublé non plus.
Ouais.
Cette corde-là soit pas doublée, fait que ça sonne plus comme un setup.
Comme un setup, ouais. So as you can see, there's something very different between writing Orientalist music and actually bothering to learn actual Oriental music. On one hand, you have Edgar, who buys books, learns the actual Dasgah music theory of Persian classical music, buys an actual real physical instrument and plays them using techniques that render these instruments in the traditional way that we use in Iran. You have Jeff Van Dyke actually using real string sections and incorporating actual Middle Eastern modes and not just the same double harmonic major and Phrygian mode. You have the composer of the Crusader Kings 3 DLC working closely with Iranian musicians in order to incorporate actual Persian classical music using real instruments, real articulation, real complex microtonal modes. And then you have people not bothering to learn anything about actual Middle Eastern music theory, buying softwares, producing music on those softwares that are basically second-rate imitations of Middle Eastern instruments, not even bothering to put those instruments in their proper ethnic or national or cultural context, and then slapping the terms Persian or Arabian on them. That's why I call Orientalist music the babrabi, babrabu, mamma mia, pizzeria of actual Oriental music, in the sense that the similarity between Orientalist music and actual Middle Eastern music is the same as the similarity or the distance between Babrabi, Babrabu, Mamma Mia, Pizzeria, Mario 64, Lamborghini, and the actual Italian language. On one hand, you have putting in the work of understanding an actual real-life language, a complex set of grammar and syntax and phonology that arose organically within an anthropological context over the course of 2,000 years. And on the other hand, you have a bunch of tropes and cliches and stereotypes that just immediately sound like that thing, but it's a gross exaggeration of that thing. I won't hide to you that it's quite frustrating to see comments of people praising these songs for and thanking the composers for telling them, oh, thank you so much for giving me an insight into how Middle Eastern music sounds like, because this is the equivalent of clicking on a YouTube video that is titled The Italian Language, and then somebody going, a Lamborghini, a Mamma Mia, a Pizzeria, babarabi, babarabu. And people going, oh, thank you, now I know what the Italian language sounds like. Thank you for thank you for putting in the work of learning to speak Italian. I'm not trying to shit on Orientalist music, but I'm trying to show it for what it is. Orientalist music is undoubtedly beautiful from an artistic point of view. However, just because we enjoy a piece of art does not mean that we need to find mental gymnastics to elevate it above what it actually is. Enjoying a piece of art does not automatically confer upon it the prestige of deep antiquity and anthropology and tradition. First, I want to start by describing the obvious, which is how Orientalism sucks for the people represented by Orientalism. And the most obvious reason is because it completely misrepresents our cultures and who we are. It reduces us down to a bunch of tropes and stereotypes and cliches without actually putting in any work respecting the complex anthropological, ethnomusicological, cultural, linguistic factors that define who we are. Now, you will have noticed that I was a bit highly critical, let's say, of these YouTube composers and not so much of soundtrack artists like Hans Zimmer and everything. And there's a reason for that. A soundtrack is a soundtrack. It does not claim to be Arabian music or Persian music. Soundtracks are not titled this way. The problem is those videos on YouTube, they are called Persian music, Arabian music, Egyptian music. Now, I don't want to be disingenuous here. I know that they were using these terms not as literal anthropological signifiers. When they say Persian, it doesn't literally mean Persian. In their minds, Persian means vibe for cobra, desert sand. Arabian means camel, spice, turban. That's all these words mean to them. But you don't need a PhD in linguistics and communication to understand that if you post a video that's called Persian music and you offer no more context in the description or a pinned comment, the average person is going to walk away from this video thinking that they've just heard actual Persian music. As somebody who is trying to be an educator of actual historical music and actual ethnic traditions, I constantly have to deal with people who are misinformed by channels like these coming to me saying, oh, you know, these guys have recreated ancient Arabian music. And it's like, no, they fucking haven't. They've bought a software that emulates digitally the sound of Iranian and Armenian instruments and Indian instruments, and they're throwing it together and they've called it ancient Arabian. I'm not accusing them of spreading misinformation willfully or that they have bad intentions. All that I'm accusing them of is of being extremely careless and spreading misinformation through carelessness. Please understand, I am not criticizing them for having created Orientalist music. It is absolutely fine. It is their choice. It is a valid form of artistic expression. Now, it is a bunch of lazy stereotypes that are borderline offensive, but art is art. It is a valid form of expression. If that's the one that they were inspired by, they have every right to go for that. It just boggles my mind that in the 10 years that some of those videos amassed 15 million views, 15 million views, not once did it occur to them that we are using the name of other cultures whose music we know nothing about, that we haven't even studied. Maybe we should be slightly responsible on some level. Maybe we should just have like a sentence somewhere in the description clarifying that we don't actually know anything about the actual Middle Eastern music. Because they're very thorough in their descriptions when it comes to listing old softwares that they used. Oh, they're very thorough about that. But a single sentence of, we don't actually know what Middle Eastern music sounds like, this is not literally Middle Eastern music, that never even crossed their minds. in the process of gaining upwards of 15 million views. Not saying they should have changed the title or even changed the music or removed the video, just a sentence in the description. And they could not be bothered to even do that much, which leads me to two conclusions. Either these guys actually think that they've written actual Middle Eastern music, or more likely, and I think that's the more likely answer, they never cared. We really should not be surprised that taking into consideration the misrepresentation of those cultures never once crossed the minds of those musicians, because you look at the titles, things like Desert Prince, Princess of Persia, Cobras in the Sand. That's what a Swedish 4-year-old's idea of Middle Eastern culture is. I'm not surprised that it never occurred to those guys not to misrepresent the anthropological reality of the Middle East, because as far as they care, the Middle East isn't an actual anthropological reality made up of actual people and actual cultures who are every bit as tangible as the Scots and the Dutch being actual people and actual cultures. To them, the Middle East is like Narnia or Middle Earth. It's some abstract, exotic other that exists for them to fantasize and fetishize in an exoticized manner. It never occurred to them that Iranians and Arabs are actual people and they have actual instruments and an actual musical tradition, and maybe if we're going to use their names, maybe we should do so with some amount of responsibility. Somebody whose idea of Middle Eastern cultures amounts to desert in the sand and desert prince and bazaar merchants, that's exactly how you would expect them to treat the Middle East. Based on the comments that these videos have received, we can see that the vast majority of people who have listened to this have no idea what they've actually been listening to. The first example of Arabian and Middle Eastern music available on the internet to most people is neither Arabian nor Middle Eastern music, but rather a bunch of lazy cliches and stereotypes cobbled together using softwares, and no understanding whatsoever or effort put into actually understanding the actual music theory. And here we get to how Orientalism did Westerners dirty. For decades, Western audiences have been robbed of the possibility of experiencing one of the richest regions of the world in terms of cultural diversity, architecture-wise, literature-wise, language-wise, clothing-wise, history-wise, and music-wise. I have shown that picture many times to Westerners, and they say, "What is that?" And I tell them, that is historical Iranian armor of the elite soldiers of the Sasanian Empire. And they go, "Holy shit, this looks amazing. Why don't we ever get that in our representations of Eastern media?" Yeah, you could. You could get that. But the problem is Orientalism won't let you. You could see the incredibly diverse clothings that the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Achaemenids, and all those diverse civilizations throughout the 5,000 years of Middle Eastern history have had. Or you could just be given the same slop repeatedly. Orientalism deciding for you that, Western audiences will be confused if they don't have turbans and scimitars, so just give them the same repetitive, stereotypical armors and clothing over and over again. I will die on the hill that Orientalism has done Western audiences dirty. It has robbed them of so many incredible soundscapes, traditional instruments, modes, melodies, this entire world, this entire treasure trove of amazing aesthetics lies out there. But Western media keeps robbing them of that possibility for no reason other than taking for granted that they're too stupid to be able to absorb anything else. A common comment that I get often is people saying Western audiences are not ready for non-Orientalist music. Orientalist music is palatable to the Western ear, and therefore that's all we can expect the Westerners to enjoy. That is completely false in my experience. In my experience, half of my subscriber base is from the West, and they absolutely adore the Middle Eastern music that I produce. A comment that I get very often by Westerners who discover my epic Iranian playlist is, "Holy shit, I never heard that. I never heard those sounds. I never heard those instruments. I never heard those modes. This sounds completely different." Western audiences crave and thirst for authentic representations of other cultures, because the moment you authentically decide to represent other cultures, you unlock things that are new from the Western perspective. See, Orientalism is the norm, and this is why I think Orientalism is absolutely horrendous. It's not just insulting to us Easterners. more than anybody, it is insulting to Westerners because it takes Westerners for idiots, and in so doing, for the past 100 years, Westerners have consistently been robbed and deprived of actual representations of the East, actual anthropological realities that are far deeper, far more nuanced, far more layered than this fucking surface bullshit of tropes and stereotypes cobbled together. Comparatively, look at what it looks like when you treat those cultures as actual cultures and not just a bunch of stereotypes. Let's say that I want to make a piece of music about the Safavids, an Iranian dynasty who ruled in the early modern era. Well, the Safavids were Sufis. Sufis are the Islamic mystics, and in this region, they enter musical trances using rhythmical breaths. So I can use that as the basis of the music. What instruments should I use? Well, I could use the tambour, because in the Iranian plateau, the tambour is closely tied to Sufi musical practices, and I'll get a Kurdish tambour player to play it for me. But what mode to play it in? Well, Esfahan is widely seen in Iran as the royal mode that is applied to the court and imperial sounds and everything. Heard less so in folk music, but very much heard in Persian classical music. That'll give it that sort of haughty royal sound. Owen Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, was a poet who wrote in an early form of the Azerbaijani language, so I could use these as lyrics for the song, his actual poetry written by himself.
Allah Allah din qaziler deyin shah manam.
And I'll add Persian lyrics because, of course, they were an Iranian dynasty, so their language of state was Persian. And I can get an actual Persian classical vocalist to sing, not with Arabic vocal techniques, not with Indian vocal techniques, but with actual Persian classical vocal techniques. And then you would have a unique soundscape that you've never heard in any Western media ever that sounds like this. Or instead, you could just have a representation of the Safavids like this. You could get to know that the Middle East has many different biomes, like northern Iran, where my people, the Mazandarani people, and our close relatives, the Gilani people, developed our own cultures in the mountains, in the forests. Or you could just get the same representation of the Middle East, which is... Imagine if Hollywood decided to make a movie about the Sasanian Empire, the second Persian Empire of the Sasanians. Imagine if it rooted its music in modern Iranian music, thematically hearkening to ancient Iranian music, and it used these ancient modes and everything, and Middle Persian lyrics in the soundtrack. You would have something that sounds like this. But instead, because Western media is stubbornly Orientalist, you'll get this. Imagine soundtracks set in Turkey and Anatolia that incorporate the sound of the Turkish ashik, the Turkish bards playing their traditional bağlama. Imagine soundtracks with shots of people going through parts of Anatolia to this music.
Eyvallah pirim eyvallah, adı güzeldir güzel şah.
But instead, because Western media works the way it does, what you'll get instead is this. Imagine a Prince of Persia game that is actually rooted in Iranian culture. Imagine a Prince of Persia wearing Sasanian armor. But instead, all you're gonna get is the Prince of Persia wearing Arabic headwears. Imagine if Western media actually understood that in Iran we have our own mythology. You know how Greek mythology has its own lore, its own characters, heroes and folklore and everything? We have our own in Iran. You have the story of Zal, who was born with white hair, therefore cast up on a mountain to die there by his parents. But then he was rescued by the Simorgh, the great bird of wisdom who speaks to humans, a bird who is often sent by Ahura Mazda, the god of light, to fight against Ahriman, the god of evil. And then his son Rustam is born. Rustam, who is the Iranian Heracles, wearing that horn helmet, and he goes to Mazandaran to fight the white div, the white demons. Chances are, if you're from the West and you're watching this video, you never knew that we Iranians literally have our own mythology that is every bit as complex with its own unique creatures and everything as Greek mythology. Consider what you've been missing on. You've been missing on an entire mythology like Norse mythology, like Greek mythology, with its own creatures, its own heroes, its own stories, its own betrayals, its own tragedies, and you've been robbed of that completely by Western media. Because anytime it approaches Iran, what does it do? Fucking turbans, fucking scimitars, flying fucking carpets, magic genie in a lamp, sand, desert, camel, cobra. Why? Because Western media treats its audience as idiots who are too closed-minded to accept anything outside of that. I think that shows how insulting Orientalism is towards the Westerners more than anyone else. Anyway, I don't have much else to say about the video. Thank you for listening to this very long analysis. And if you're interested in more of the subject, if you now realize just how dirty Orientalism did you by keeping you in the dark about musical traditions that you've never heard about, you know, go look for them. Don't just stop at these software-based things and everything, and you'll see that there's an entire treasure trove. It'll open you to the possibilities of what you could have been experiencing all this time. Goodbye.